storylines, burning questions, and rankings for the Washington Commanders linebacker group on today's episode of Locked On Commanders.
Your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome into your Monday episode of Locked On Commanders, your daily podcast covering the Washington Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I hope you've had a happy and healthy weekend. And thank you for getting the week started here with me. Thank you so much for making Locked On Commanders your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget that you can subscribe for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're on YouTube, please hit a like on this video so that other Commanders fans can find it just like you did. And if you want to continue this conversation after the episode today, just head over to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders, and you can text directly with me, your host, David Harrison, on Twitter at DHarrison82, credential member of the media and Washington Commanders beat reporter for Commander Country, a part of Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation. Here with you every Monday through Friday, along with our everydayers. And as always, I appreciate your continued support for the program. On today's episode of Locked On Commanders, we're going to discuss Jamin Davis and the Washington linebacker group. But before we get there, I have to tell you that this episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. ESPN linebacker rankings leads to an interesting trade idea that we're going to discuss. And we discuss what Jamin Davis has to do to convince Washington to pick up his fifth-year option at the end of the season. But we're going to start our linebacker training camp preview with a look at the starters and the immediate backups entering late July. And our pre-training camp depth chart is going to look like Cody Barton as the starting Mike linebacker, David Mayo as the second Mike linebacker behind him. And then at will, Jamin Davis and Khaleke Hudson being the backup. And of course, Will, typically talking weak side, but I've seen Jamin Davis line up strong side, weak side, basically your other linebacker. And really, that's the only two linebacker positions. I know we consider the Washington Commanders to be a base 4-3 type of defense, but really in today's NFL, the base 4-3, base 3-4s have almost all but disappeared. And really every defense is multiple, just depending on what personnel packages they have. But we've seen the Washington Commanders over the last year really reduce from using three linebackers to really using two linebackers to really at times, especially for stretches, only using one linebacker. And it's going to be interesting to see whether that one linebacker, when they do go to that look, is Cody Barton, Jamin Davis, or who knows, maybe it's somebody else. And that's going to be something that we're watching during training camp. And that kicks off our battles and storylines part of today's episode. The first storyline that I'm going to be watching, and I think that we're all really going to be watching, first of all, Jamin Davis's health. Is he even able to participate in training camp right off the bat? If you remember, he had to skip OTAs, skip the mini camp. I don't want to say skip. He was there, just couldn't participate fully because of the minor, quote unquote, from what we're being told from the team, knee procedure that he had. It does sound like the knee procedure was shortly before the team had a report. Maybe it was a newly found issue that he decided to go ahead and get cleaned up. But if it wasn't, it almost kind of reminds me like the Scottie Pippen situation or the Michael Thomas situation. Take your off season, go on your vacation, and then when you're about to get on the clock, that's when you take care of your surgeries and all that stuff. And look, if that's the case, that's certainly within Jamin Davis's right as a human being. But obviously, sports teams don't typically like that kind of optic on it. Again, I'm not sure if that's what happened. Maybe it was something that was just discovered right before OTAs and minicamp. So don't take that as me dogging on Jamin Davis. Just interesting timing as to when the stuff happened. As he said, it was kind of shortly before they reported for the OTA period. But his third-year option is coming up, and that's really kind of the biggest part of this whole thing. His third-year option has to be picked up between the end of this season, his third season in the NFL, and the beginning of next season, right around draft time. We just went through this with Chase Young. Jamin Davis is the next first-round pick from the following year up on the block. So the Washington Commanders have a decision to make on Jamin Davis and whether or not they're going to secure him for a fifth season and have to pay him that fifth-year option, or if they're not going to secure him and essentially give him the path to becoming an unrestricted free agent in the 2025 offseason if they decide not to. So that's something that we're going to talk about a lot more here in the next coming year and, of course, in the early parts of the next offseason. But as we're going through training camp, as we're going through preseason, getting into the season, something we need to look for is how healthy does he look? How comfortable does he look his third year in Jack Del Rio's defense? Our first battle that we want to talk about is a battle of backups, Khaleke Hudson versus Milo Eifler. Now, last year, Khaleke Hudson had more snaps on defense and he had more snaps on special teams. So I think clearly Khaleke Hudson is the guy that comes in as the favorite to kind of win the pecking order battle as far as linebackers are concerned. But Milo Eifler is still a young guy. He's still a guy who's got something to prove. Perhaps he can come in and convince these coaches otherwise. And then the third one is going to be Cody Barton's pass coverage. That's the thing that I'm kind of looking for the most. When we do see that Mike linebacker on the field in a Jack Del Rio scheme, typically they're either in run support because everybody's in run support when the ball is handed off, or he's in pass coverage. Not a lot of blitzing coming from the likes of Cole Holcomb in the past, or even Jamin Davis when he's been lined up in the mic. And in 2022, 81 linebackers had 20 or more pass rushes all season long. Cole Holcomb was one of them, able to get 20 pass rushes before he was lost for the season. And he ranked 51st of the 81 in rush pass percentage, had a pass coverage percentage of 89.7. So even though Cole had 20 pass rushes before he got hurt, definitely in the second or the bottom half of the in the NFL of linebackers who had at least 20 pass rushes. Barton, meanwhile, had a 94.2% coverage rate, so even more than Cole Holcomb, getting a better pass coverage rating and allowing a smaller percentage of passes completed against. However, Holcomb was credited with allowing 3 touchdowns in his pass defense, tied for the most in the NFL among linebackers with at least 200 passes or pass coverage snaps, rather. Meanwhile, Barton, not in the same group, but he had 5 touchdown passes allowed, but he also had 2 interceptions and came away with a better QBR allowed against him, mainly because of those interceptions. Basically, a push. Honestly, when I look at the two players, because when you look at the stats, Cole Holcomb comes out ahead, right? When you look at the grades, Cole Holcomb comes out ahead. But when you think about Cole Holcomb's health issue and the health problem that he had, and then the fact that Del Rio's scheme is considered a better fit for Barton than the scheme he was playing in Seattle, those differences in the stats and the grades and all this stuff, in theory, because of the scheme and the fit with Cody Barton, will make itself up. That's at least the theory, right? So those are our 3 storylines and battles that we're watching. Moving on to some 2022 facts and stats. The Commanders only retained 1 of 3 unrestricted free agent off-ball linebackers. David Mayo is the one they retained. They, of course, lost Cole Holcomb to the Pittsburgh Steelers, and veteran John Bostic is not re-signed, and he's also still a free agent at this time. So despite losing 2 veteran linebackers, or letting them walk per se, the only changes to this linebacker group from last year. So obviously you have 3 unrestricted free agents. You only re-sign 1 of them. Clearly signals that you think there needs to be a change in the room. But because even with all that, the only change is really the addition of Cody Barton and the elevation of Khaleke Hudson, because they didn't go out and get any additional linebackers either through the draft or through free agency. And Khaleke Hudson will theoretically join or jump up into the role that John Bostic had last season. Now, again, partially due, or well, in large part due to the injury to Cole Holcomb, John Bostic had the 3rd most linebacker snaps on the defense last year with 263 of them. And he had the 4th most snaps on special teams with 184. For a total of 447 snaps. Now, it's 25 to 35% of the season snaps, but that's it's a fairly significant part of the year, especially depending on the stretch that it comes in and what the circumstances are, right? So Jamin Davis's career best season in 2022 in tackles led the Commanders with 104 tackles. So Jamin Davis's career best in tackles so far came in 2022, and he led the team with 104 tackles. I think that's a better way of saying it. Now, that 104 tackles, while it led the team, ranks tied for 48th in the National Football League in tackles, and is the lowest tackle leader for a Washington defense since 2005. That's the fewest amount of tackles to lead the team in tackles since 2005. So while, yes, it's a career high, while, yes, Jamin Davis led the team in tackles, the bar that he just hurdled was fairly low. And speaking of Jamin, what is the minimum that Jamin Davis has to achieve to get his 5th-year option picked up? That's the first of 2 burning questions that I'm going to answer coming up next about this linebacker group. That's next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you need to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. Once you get your job posted, throw the purple hashtag hiring frame onto your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you are looking to hire. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience, so you can quickly prioritize who you want to interview and then find out who you want to hire. That's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster, Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Thanks for making Locked On Commanders your first listen or your first view today. Every day. We've got a new mailbag episode coming tomorrow with just a couple, really not even a full couple weeks left before the start of training camp. So if you want to throw in questions for that mailbag episode, whether it's that one or one in the future, do that by dropping them in the YouTube comments. Find me on Twitter, email me, or hit me up via Subtext. You can simply just text me your question on your phone. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders to get in on that. Starting off with our burning questions here about the Washington Commanders linebacker group. Burning question number one, what is the floor stats-wise, production-wise for Jamin Davis to convince Washington to pick up his fifth-year option? So when I went and dove into this, right, I wanted to look at first, and we've talked about this every day, as we talked about this a couple times, but I want to give you a little bit of a different angle on it in this part of the discussion. Now, the fifth-year option value next year, well, for 2025, so if they pick it up next year, then they'll pay it in 2025, will be north of $12 million. I think this year for a linebacker, the base value is like $11.7 million. So next year, the base value for the year option, again, there are tiers. That's what we've talked about in previous episodes, is the tiers of fifth year options. Obviously, they only go higher. So bare minimum, by the time the Washington Commanders come around to picking up the fifth year option next year, if they do, it's going to be over $12 million that they pay Jamin Davis in 2025, right? Currently, if you compare that to current contracts, that would be seventh in terms of average value among off-ball linebackers. Now, given the rate of new contracts and all this stuff, by the time they actually pay it, you're probably looking at 10 to 12, maybe 15th in the league, depending on how linebacker contracts go. Devin White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is going to be due for a fairly big one, people assume. So that will probably jump up ahead, knocking Jamin and knocking this fifth-year option value down to at least eighth or ninth, right? So if you want top seven stats, all right, if you want like production for value for money, if you want top seven stats across the board, then you're looking at something in the ballpark that Jamin Davis needs to produce this year of 144 tackles, which is 40 more than he had last year, 11 tackles for loss, 9 sacks, and 13 passes defense. And that's important because the Washington Commanders don't really blitz Jamin Davis a lot. So if he's short on the sacks, but higher on the PBUs, higher on the tackles for loss and run support, then you live with, a shortage of the sacks, because it's hard to get sacks when you're really not blitzing all that often right now. But does he really need to produce at top seven level, right? Like, we would love to live in a world, at least general managers and bookkeepers in the NFL would love to live in a world where you get paid what you earn, it's like type of thing. Like, just get rid of contracts altogether and just make some sort of a payment chart and say, boom, the number one quarterback gets this much, the number one linebacker gets this much, so on and so forth. Where you rank in production is what you get paid. But that's not how this works, right? So when you pay a guy a contract or you agree to terms on a contract, you would like to get that type of production. But at the same time, we have to remember that teams don't always just pay a guy for boom, just black and white. There's a gray area here. So does Jamin Davis really need to produce at a top seven level? Well, I don't know that he does, because in 2021, Jamin Davis, his rookie season, Jamin Davis tied for 51st in the NFL in tackles. He was tied for 103rd in tackles for loss, tied for 82nd in sacks, tied for 97th in passes defense. Now in 2022, though, his numbers all rose. He was tied for 37th in tackles, which is nearly a 20-spot climb, tied for 27th in tackles for losses, which is like an 80-spot climb, tied for 48th in sacks, which is about a 40-spot climb, and tied for 94th in passes defense, which is only a 3-spot climb, but it's still an improvement, right? So you saw an improvement in year two from year one. So I think what you would like to have if you're looking at this is what we would call a breakout season. And to me, that would, for Jamin Davis, would be becoming a top 32 off-ball linebacker. Maybe that's too low, but again, we're talking about the floor. What's the minimum? I think that's the minimum that he would need to do. And you want a minimum of these stats in 3 of the 4 stat lines to be the 32nd ranked linebacker over the past 3 years on average, 101.5 tackles, 15 tackles for loss, 8 sacks, 8 passes defenders. Now, if he got all of those stats, the tackles for losses, the sacks, and the passes defense would all be career highs. The tackles obviously would not be, as he had 104 just this last season. So I think if Jamin can get 101 or more tackles, 15 or more tackles for losses, and either 8 sacks or more, or either 8 passes defense, again, he's not going to blitz all that often, so at least we don't expect him to. So it's kind of hard to really put an expectation on the sack numbers. But if he can get there or get close to it, then I think certainly you can see an opportunity for Jamin Davis to get his 5th-year option picked up. When you look at the incremental growth that he's had over the first 2 seasons, if he has that growth in the 3rd season, then that could inspire Washington to say, you know what? Okay, let's pick up his 5th-year option. Let's get this 4th season, get even more growth. And then we've got this 5th season under the 5th-year option. We get to work on a contract extension after that. So that's our first burning question. Second burning question, did Washington mess up by not drafting an off-ball linebacker, specifically a Mike, but really an off-ball linebacker? Well, I think if you're going to have this conversation, you kind of have to say, well, which pick would you give up to get an off-ball linebacker? Because if you can't just say, well, let's add a rookie and nothing else, no other consequences happen, right? If you take a guy somewhere, you're going to lose a guy somewhere, right? So we start with Emmanuel Forbes, the 1st-round pick. The next linebacker drafted after Emmanuel Forbes was drafted was Jack Campbell out of Iowa, who a lot of people had as the number 1 off-ball linebacker. Certainly a good talent. Would I give up Jack Campbell for Emmanuel Forbes? No, I wouldn't. I think that the Washington Commanders went a solid route, and again, I get the value of having seen him in rookie camp and OTAs and mini camp, right? To say this right now, back in April, would I have told you the same thing? I don't know. I might have told you if the options are Jack Campbell, Emmanuel Forbes, I think I would have said, well, trade back, and then maybe you get one of these guys. But right now, here as we stand today, if I had the opportunity to trade Jack Campbell for Emmanuel Forbes, I wouldn't do it. I would keep Emmanuel Forbes. So no, they didn't make a mistake there. Second pick of the NFL draft for the Commanders, Quan Martin, defensive back. The next linebacker off the board, Drew Sanders out of Arkansas. That's really interesting. And here's where I would get a little bit tricky, because with Emmanuel Forbes on the field, I'm not against moving Kendall Fuller inside. It doesn't look like the team's going to do it, but I'm not against it. Benjamin St. Juste goes inside. Danny Johnson goes inside. You've got good. Percy Butler can play inside. You got a good depth of defensive backs there. Now, I don't hate the pick of Quan Martin, and I love what I've seen so far. So that's kind of hard, but I think this is really kind of the hardest part for me. Quan Martin or Drew Sanders, that would be a sticking point. But let's move on real quick to the 3rd pick of the draft, offensive center Ricky Schomburg out of Arkansas. The next linebacker draft was Ventrell Miller out of Florida. No, I wouldn't flip those. Why? Because the next pick for the Commanders, Braden Daniels, offensive lineman, he was drafted before Ventrell Miller as well. So why would I give up my 3rd-round offensive lineman for a linebacker taken after my 4th-round offensive lineman, right? So the question really is, would you rather have Braden Daniels or Ventrell Miller? 5th round, KJ Henry is the defensive end that gets taken. We talked about this going into it. I think that they needed to take a defensive end. So I absolutely love that pick. And KJ Henry was a great prospect to use that pick on. Noah Sewell was the next linebacker off the board out of Oregon. Chris Rodriguez, the running back, your 6th-round pick. Amari Burney out of Florida was the next linebacker off the board. And then Andre Jones in the 7th round. There were no off-ball linebackers drafted after Andre Jones. So if I had to pick selections to swap, I think it would be Braden Daniels for Ventrell Miller or KJ Henry for Noah Sewell. Now, there's an unlikely usage for Braden Daniels here this season. Now, that's kind of the case for swapping Braden Daniels. The case for swapping KJ Henry is you already have solid depth at defensive end. We saw when Chase Young went out, that group really kind of stepped up and did pretty well. Now, you did lose a defensive end, Shaka Toney, to the whole gambling deal, so that's a little bit of an impact. And then you look at the contracts. That's, I think, the thing that the Commanders had to look at is the lack of contracted defensive ends in 2024. Having KJ Henry gives you a guy on contract. Obviously, if you keep Shaka Toney, he'll have a year left on his contract. You re-sign Montez Sweat, Chase Young. Now you've got 3 defensive ends who have experience in Jack Del Rio's defense, and they're all secure for the next season. And then for the offensive line, the injury bug, right? I think that has to be one of the reasons that the Washington Commanders went ahead and went the direction they did. So I don't know if I would say that Washington made a mistake per se, because you can only address so many needs in the NFL draft. But of course, those are kind of some of the options. And there's still some free agents available, right? Zach Cunningham is still out there. Deion Jones, who had 6 tackles for loss last year, 2.5 sacks, 3 passes defense for the Cleveland Browns, is out there. Miles Jack had 104 tackles, which would have led the Commanders in tackles, 3 passes defense. He's still out there. And then, of course, Rashaan Evans, who we've talked about quite a bit, 159 tackles last year, 6 tackles for loss, 2 sacks, and 4 passes defensed. We could, I don't think we're going to, but could still see them add there. Where do Washington linebackers rank according to ESPN? It's not going to surprise you where they rank, but an idea that stemmed from the fates of 2 2020 first-round picks involved this linebacker group, and that might surprise you. That's coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders. Wrap it up today's episode of Locked On Commanders. We have reached our rankings portion of the program, and not entirely surprising, but ESPN didn't have Jamin Davis or Cody Barton on their top 10 off-ball linebacker rankings list. It wasn't just ESPN, though. This ESPN ranking that we're talking about was a poll of NFL executives, coaches, and scouts. So these are people inside the league, inside the business, that are not putting Davis or Barton on the ESPN's top 10. But again, it's top 10. You know what I mean? They didn't go to 32. PFF went to 32. They didn't have Jamin Davis or Cody Barton on there either. The 10 that did make the ESPN list, again, according to these NFL executives, coaches, and scouts, first up was Fred Warner of the San Francisco 49ers. Roquan Smith of Baltimore was second. Tremaine Edmonds of the Chicago Bears, third. Matt Milano of the Buffalo Bills, fourth. Devin White of the Buccaneers, fifth. Demario Davis from New Orleans, sixth. Shaq Leonard from the Colts came in seventh. Nick Bolton from the Chiefs was eighth. CJ Mosley from the Jets was ninth. And Dre Greenlaw from the 49ers was 10th. But they did have some honorable mentions as well. Bobby Wagner from the Seahawks, Levante David from the Buccaneers, Foyesade Oluokun from the Jacksonville Jaguars, Logan Wilson from the Bengals, and Patrick Queen from the Baltimore Ravens. And Patrick Queen is kind of the interesting part here because Bleacher Report recently ideated some trades that they say would shake up the NFL, and one of them involved the Ravens trading Queen to the Washington Commanders and a fourth-round pick next year. So a 2024 fourth-round pick and linebacker Patrick Queen to the Washington Commanders for defensive end Chase Young. Now, Patrick Queen was a first-round pick in the same year that Chase Young was a first-round pick. Neither team has had their fifth-year option picked up, but Patrick Queen, off-ball linebacker, Chase Young, obviously defensive end. Not the first Chase Young trade idea we've heard or discussed here on the program, but it's interesting just because they did both have their fifth-year options decline. Bleacher Report said this of Queen, quote, "The Ravens didn't pick up Patrick Queen's fifth-year option either. They did, however, hand Roquan Smith a 5-year, $100 million contract after trading for him midseason. He's been productive. He had 117 combined tackles and 5 sacks in 2022, and he played in every game since he's been drafted. The Commanders would get a steady presence at linebacker, while the Ravens would get an edge rusher who could help take their defense to the next level," end quote. Now, of course, in order for this to happen, Washington, Ron Rivera, Martin Mayhew, they would basically have to already be to the realization that we're not going to bring Chase Young back. And I don't know that they're there yet. I think they're truly looking to give him the opportunity this season to show them that he should be a part of their long-term plans, but also let Montez Sweat show them that he should be part of their long-term plans. And this is something I know several Commanders fans have kind of talked about this in the YouTube comments on social media. Maybe Chase Young is a trade deadline move. You know what I mean? And honestly, even if the Commanders are doing well, but they feel like James Smith-Williams or KJ Henry or somebody else is ready to step up and ready to fill that void, if they do it, but they're having some struggles at linebacker, maybe we see the Commanders pull off this trade midseason. The Ravens will do it. You know what I mean? If you're not going to trade, if you're not going to sign Patrick Queen, if you're the Baltimore Ravens, which I don't know how you re-sign Patrick Queen, a former first-round draft pick who's had some steady production, had some presence, to a new contract when you just gave Roquan Smith $100 million. So to me, it seems very likely that Patrick Queen is going to become a free agent next offseason. If that's the case, send him somewhere else, get back some help this season to help Lamar Jackson. And, Commanders fans would hate to see Chase Young go right up the highway or whatever and have success. But, if it gets to the point where the Commanders feel like they're not going to move forward with Chase and the deal is on the board, maybe take it. It's intriguing. I got to tell you, I don't hate it. I don't hate the idea. I just don't see it happening, especially before training camp or even during training camp. But even if the trade doesn't happen next year, if the Washington Commanders are back in the same spot with the linebackers, with the off-ball linebackers, and need a new Mike linebacker, maybe Patrick Queen is a free agent name to keep an eye out. We've talked about this, right? They're going to have, or potentially could have, close to $100 million in cap space if they play their cards right. So maybe Patrick Queen's a name that we're going to be done talking about on this episode. We may not be done talking about in totality. Coming up tomorrow, we've got another mailbag episode coming. And again, if you want to get questions in for that episode or for future episodes, drop them in the YouTube comments, email them to lockedoncommanders@gmail.com. Hit me on Twitter at dharrison82 or text me via subtext. As always, I want to thank you for making Locked On Commanders your first listen of the day, every day and every day. I want to thank you for coming through on a consistent basis like you do. And remember, you can continue this conversation by texting me at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders. Thank you so much for making me a part of your day, part of your football routine. If you have anything else Washington Commanders related that you want to know or discuss, make sure you follow me on Twitter at dharrison82. Until we speak again, please be safe, be kind, and I'll see you next time for another episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.